So I want to begin with a quotation from Walter Pater's The Renaissance, because I think that this gives a very good example of exactly what it is that I'm after in this project. Great passions may give us this quicksand sense of life, ecstasy and sorrow of love, the various forms of enthusiastic activity, disinterested or otherwise, which come naturally to many of us. Now, this is taken from the conclusion, the very controversial conclusion to the Renaissance, which appears very late in the 19th century. But to any reader of the 18th century, the kind of aesthetic expression that Pater here is referencing should come as no surprise. This is, without the actual word being named, a version of what those of us who study the 18th century and Romantic period would understand immediately to be the sublime, the ecstasy, the sorrow of love, the enthusiastic activity. And yet, if we take a look at the book as a whole, that, the sublime, is the one thing that's missing. It's certainly a fact that Pater is very invested in certain forms of aesthetic expression, even those that go back to the 18th century. So for example, he uses the word beautiful 35 times in the book, the word picturesque 3 times, the word grotesque 10. And these are all terms that very much are rooted in 18th century aesthetic theory. It even uses the word arabesque 4 times. But the sublime doesn't actually appear in the text at all. And this is a fascinating absence. After all, it's not that Pater is completely eschewing the work of 18th century aesthetics. All of the other terms do make an appearance, and he's clearly referencing something that is familiar to readers as the sublime, but he doesn't use the word. And this is where the project really starts. The question of why. Why does the sublime go away? And this isn't really a new question, although we really haven't had the apparatus to pose the question or to begin to approach an answer. Most studies of the sublime posit a rise throughout the 18th century. That is, there is this phenomenon, this aesthetic phenomena that gets recognized, certainly in classical times with Pseudo Longinus, that's translated into English in the middle of the 17th century, and then which sort of grips the imagination in increasing ways throughout the 18th century until we get to the Romantic period, at which the sublime arrives at an apotheosis, and then, well, and then what? According to Samuel Monk, certainly the end point of the sublime and the history of the sublime lies in the Romantic period and the ways in which that informed the poets and the writers of that movement. And in the same way, Thomas Weiskell, who takes a more philosophic approach to the sublime, locates the apotheosis of the term in Kant, but both acknowledge that this is sort of the end point of the history they're telling without explaining why that might be the case. What happens? Where does it go? Does the sublime, in fact, disappear? And if it does, why does it do that? Why does one of the most popular aesthetic terms of the 18th century seem to vanish from aesthetic discourse immediately after the Romantic period? Well, so the first question that I wanted to ask in terms of this project was, does the sublime actually go away? Is this simply a kind of philosophic trope, or do people actually stop talking about it? And so to do that, and to do all of the quantitative work in this corpus, or in this project, I assembled a corpus that gives me, I think, a fairly broad perspective on the period that I'm interested in. So here you can see the different collections that I've included in this corpus, from the early English books online, which is mostly late 17th century, the 18th century collections online and 19th century collections online from Gale, a number of Chadwick-Healy collections, including the ProQuest Historic Literary Criticism, which will be important. Together, these number about 310,000 volumes and about 6.4-ish billion words. And the period that I'm examining here, and it will become apparent hopefully through my presentation why I've made this selection, is from 1660 to 1860. And the questions that I'm posing through this corpus is, or are, what is the trajectory of the sublime across this period? And if in fact it does rise and then fall, how can we interrogate the concept of the sublime using quantitative methods to understand why these different forms of evolution within the history of the sublime took place? And so the very first question, does the sublime in fact go away, can be answered fairly straightforwardly with a corpus like this, with a fairly simple series of graphs. And before I get there, I do want to take a second and acknowledge that this corpus is biased in some very interesting ways. And when I say that this corpus is biased, what I'm really acknowledging is that all corpora are biased. That sort of dream of digital humanities where we'll suddenly someday have all of the texts that were ever created and be able to understand all phenomena immediately that animated a lot of the work in the very, very early years, has given way to a very realistic acknowledgement that the corpora that we have, including this, which is a very significant number of texts from the period, but it's not an evenly sampled number of texts from the period. And it's important to acknowledge what's missing here. These are all printed works, which means that they had to have been actually printed by a print shop. So the rich manuscript culture that motivated a lot of work in the 16th century or 17th century and early 18th century especially, but also in the late 18th and 19th century is missing. And that's really important because as many scholars such as Diana Solomon, for example, Michel Levy had shown, the manuscript culture of the 18th and 19th century was predominantly written by women. And so we're missing, for example, a large number of voices in this discussion by looking at this corpus. This corpus is also interestingly tilted towards the literary. And that wasn't completely non-deliberate on my part. In other words, I'm interested in the sublime as a literary phenomenon as compared to how it exists outside of the literary context. And so, as we'll see pretty quickly, there is a literary bias in this corpus, but ways to sort of tease out what's happening in the extra-literary context. So I want to acknowledge that this isn't a complete view of what's going on in the 2 centuries that I'm interested in, but I think it does give us, in a way that we haven't had access to before, a very large scale understanding of what's going on. This is the telescope of the digital humanities turned on the constellation of the sublime. And it looks something like this. This is the scaled frequency per 1 million words, smoothed with a three window rolling average across the period from 1660 to 1860 in the corpora that I've assembled. And you can see immediately that there is a fairly strong pattern. We see that from the beginning, we have a fairly slow takeoff followed by across the 18th century and increasingly quickly mounting interest in the sublime, where we've become much better, unfortunately, in the last couple months at reading curves. So I can say with some confidence that you'll all understand what I see. This is an exponential curve that rises very quickly to a peak and then immediately falls in a very shocking and sudden way off. Not back down to the 1660 levels, but certainly much less than it was at its peak. And that peak and fall happens over a really, really quick period, relatively speaking, of about 10 years. Now, what's really interesting about this particular graph, or at least it was interesting to me, is that that peak occurs not during the Romantic period proper, where Monk, for example, or Hippel or Weiskel, for example, would place it, but instead about 20-ish years later, that is around 1835. And that peak happening that late immediately poses certain kinds of questions about not just why it fell off, but why did the sublime persist in a way that hasn't been acknowledged in a lot of the criticism on the term. Now, to complicate the story, if we were to take not the whole corpus, that is, remember, as I said, this corpus is very tilted towards the literary, but instead we took a fraction of the corpus that isn't literary, that is the ProQuest historical literary criticism, so the critical sublime, and we did the same graph, we find actually a slightly different pattern. Now, this is a little bumpier, it's a little more noisy because there are far fewer texts in this corpus than in the corpus overall. There's only about 5,000 as compared to the 310,000. But you can see that again, we see a rise and then a fall, and a quite sudden fall, but not quite as steep. But the important thing here is that fall happens much earlier. Here, the fall happens close to 1800 as opposed to 1830. So, In literary contexts, that is the red line on this graph, we have a rise and a fall that peaks around 1835. And in the critical context, that is the blue line in this graph, we have a peak of around 1805. So two different histories of the Sublime in two different discourses, what I'm calling the literary horizon of the Sublime and the critical horizon of the Sublime. And so the question that we began with, what happens to the Sublime? Does it vanish? And if so, why? Now becomes the second question, why are there these two divergent histories that both seem to occupy the same kind of pattern, but shifted about 20 years, about 30 years away from each other? And just to convince you that this particular pattern isn't just an artifact of the corpus, if we take a look at the frequency of the word beautiful in the same corpus, what we see is a fairly straightforward rise. If we look at the history of picturesque, again, we can see that it was a little bit later to take off. Humphrey Repton, for example, didn't write some of the seminal works on the picturesque until the middle of the 18th century. But once it arrives, it certainly does also increase and keeps increasing through to Pater's text, as we saw. Same with the grotesque. So these other concepts seem to have a very different history than the Sublime. The only one that does echo the Sublime a little bit, and I don't have the graph here, is the arabesque. But the arabesque is a slightly different concept, as hopefully we'll talk about towards the end of the talk, that echoes the Sublime in some interesting ways, but at a much, much lower frequency. So it doesn't actually become a term that is used enough to make the same kinds of claims that I want to make about these other aesthetic terms. So we have this history of aesthetics, wherein certain concepts take off and keep rising, and yet this central one, the Sublime, rises and falls. So to get at why this might be the case, I think it's actually important to start thinking about what exactly the Sublime is. And that should be easy because, after all, there's a whole cottage industry of 20th and 21st century literary and philosophic criticism dedicated to explaining to us what exactly the Sublime is. So here we see, for example, Weiskel, the Romantic Sublime, who tells us that it's a three-stage process, which involves a kind of Freudian approach of an object and then a retreat, which is fine and straightforward, except then if we open Doran's more recent theory of the Sublime, he tells us it's a dual structure that is in fact paradoxical between inferiority and superiority. And then if we open Monk, we actually find that the Sublime is an entirely subjective process, whereas Lyotard tells us that the postmodern Sublime is the way in which the modern represents the unrepresentable in presentation. And then, of course, Francis Ferguson tells us that the Sublime is simply a way of saying, oh, altitudo, and that any explanation of the Sublime whatsoever is impossible. So this isn't helpful. So maybe we go back to the 18th century. Burke, A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origin of Our Ideas in the Sublime and the Beautiful, pretty clear the Sublime is associated with ideas of pain and danger that we somehow receive pleasure from. Fine, no problem. Except that, of course, Kant tells us that it's a much more philosophical construct that has much more to do with quantity, whereas the beautiful has to do with quality. And Addison, in his notes in The Spectator, in his readings of Milton's Paradise Lost, suggests that there are two kinds of sentiments, the natural and the sublime, as opposed to the beautiful and the sublime. And Shaftesbury, of course, links the Sublime with a certain kind of religious ecstasy. And Price's essay on the picturesque tells us that the Sublime is actually a tree shattered by light. You get what I'm trying to say here. The Sublime, in other words, throughout its entire history, has been dogged with a kind of absence of meaning. That is, a multiplicity of different definitions that leaves us without a sense of what the concept of the Sublime actually is. And it's really that question of concept and word that I wanted to turn in the project. That is, can the quantitative methods that I've been using to explore this history of the Sublime somehow also let us get at not what the Sublime means, but what work it is doing? In other words, can we reconfigure our understanding of the Sublime using quantitative methods in a way that helps us understand what its particular historical, philosophical, and conceptual configuration is, at any point in its history. And here I'm thinking through the work on concepts by Peter de Bolle in The Architecture of Concepts, as well as by Koselleck, who both argue that there is a complex relationship between word and concept, because I want to begin by mapping concepts by thinking through not just the word that represents it, that is not just the word sublime itself, but instead the constellation of words that collect around the sublime and travel with it. And to do that, I wanted to turn to something called Collocate Analysis. Now, Collocate Analysis, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is simply the process of going through, finding every instance of a target word, and looking at what words appear around it. That is, what words travel with the sublime. And I'm thinking of this as I said, this constellation of words, this network, but a Latourian-like network, wherein the edges really are where the concept lies. That is, it's the configuration of this discourse around this central term, a configuration that, as we'll see, evolves over time, that I really want to focus on in terms of thinking through what we might mean by the concept of the sublime. And I want to differentiate what I'm doing here with collocates from a word embedding analysis, although we'll come back to that in a few slides. But a word embedding analysis, such as Word-to-Vector-Glove, for those of you who are familiar with it, is much more sensitive to something like synonymy. That is, if you did that kind of analysis with sublime, what you'd come up with are synonyms for the sublime. Whereas I'm really interested in proximity, not what other words mean sublime as well, but what words attach to it in order to give the word itself meaning over time. So here's the process. Each time the word sublime appears in my corpus of 4.5 billion words, I collect the 10 words that appear before and the 10 words that appear after. 10 words, by the way, because that is the average length of sentence in the corpus. So I want to capture a complete syntactic unit. The problem is, if I do that and aggregate all of the words that attach to the sublime, I get 38,764 unique words. That is a lot. That is too many words. That is a number of unique words that's longer than, for example, to use a famous literary lab equivalent, that's longer. It's a longer vector of unique words than there are words total in Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. So this is too many to understand. So we need a way to not just cut down the list, but cut down that list in a way that's meaningful and lets us understand what are significantly attached to the sublime. So here's what I did. I did 3 things to take on that word list and figure out what words have meaning in terms of the way that they travel with this central term. So first, I used a Fisher's exact test and measured every single word. And the question that asks is, what words appear next to the sublime more often than we would expect if they were just randomly distributed throughout the corpus? So for example, a word like if happens a lot in the corpus, and it happens a lot next to the word sublime, but it's not really meaningful because it's only attached to the sublime because it appears so often. So this asks the question, what words show up close to the sublime more often than we would expect? Now, pointwise mutual information is an important measure, and it will become more important, as you will see. But that does a similar thing to the Fisher's exact test, except its question is slightly different. A PMI score asks what words share information with the sublime. One of the easiest examples of this is if you imagine a 20th century or late 20th century corpus, and you find the words Queen and Elizabeth together a lot, it turns out that most of the time, when those 2 words appear together, you really don't need them both. You could say Queen, or you could say Elizabeth. And there are certainly contexts in which Queen appears that Elizabeth isn't meant, and Elizabeth appears where Queen isn't meant. But in a lot of contexts, they share information. That is, putting them both is redundant. And so I wanted to find words that shared a lot of that information with the sublime using a pointwise mutual information metric. And for the purpose of this project, I discarded any term from the list with a normalized PMI score of less than 0.4. And finally, simple frequency helps us understand what words show up a lot next to the sublime. So if I just take the top quartile of words, that is words that appear with the frequency next to sublime more than 757 times, that also gives us a really intuitive way to cut down the number of words in the word list. Sorry, that's the top 95th percentile. So in other words, the final words that I want to talk about, the final discourse that I want to say, is the sublime in a really important way in its configurations throughout the period, that we'll take a look at in a second, are the set of words that meet these three criteria. That is, they show up more often than we would expect, they share information, and they're just very frequent in terms of how often they appear. And this is the list of words that we are left with when we do that set of operations to the set of collocates. This, I want to argue, is a word list that helps us think through what discourse the sublime is attached to. And there's an important set of terms here that are helpful to think about. Some things that make a lot of sense, of course, like pathetic and elegance and awful and genius and beautiful. Some things that are not necessarily as expected, especially if you don't spend a lot of time reading aesthetic literature of the early 17th century, wherein words like Christian and glory and eternal and fire do a whole set of different work. And in fact, what we can do with this set of words, because we know when they're used next to the sublime and when we know when they're used next to each other, is we can run a classification analysis on these that lets us group them into words that are most likely to show up together in the vicinity of the sublime. And that lets us understand the different configurations of this discourse and the work that it does. So for example, group one, which I'm calling the core sublime, this contains words that really just mean sublime in a very important way throughout the whole period. Contrasted to group six, the aesthetic sublime, which are much more aestheticized terms. Then there are specific terms for climb and mountains. For those of you who are interested, these groupings are the result of a hierarchical cluster that I did using the set of terms that I derived that you saw on the previous slide, and looking at how likely they are to appear together when they appear in the same text with the word sublime. You can contrast that set of groups with these. Here we have a group that's theological rhetoric and what I'm calling theological objects. So clearly the sublime is attached to theology at important points of its history. There's a way in which it's attached to disciplinarity, that is art and rationality, knowledge, mind, religion, science, philosophy. But then we have a very Burkean group, that is words that readers of Burke would understand as the kind of physiological eye, fair, image, imagination, light, the kind of physiological affects that create the impression of the sublime. And finally, philosophical sublime, conceptions, ideas, and notions. And then we have the literary categories, the authorial sublime, author, expression, passage, passages, etc. The critical language that surrounds it, eloquence, generous language, passion. And then the poetic sublime, which is not just about poetry, but specific poets that become attached throughout this period that I'm looking at. Homer and Milton in particular become the sort of avatars of the sublime. So we can take all of these different groups and we can take all of those different words and begin to understand what the sublime is by the ways in which these different categories of words, these different discourses, do a part or play a role in making up what the sublime is at any given moment of its history. Now, because the process of doing the Collocate analysis, especially when I looked at the PMI scores, because that let us create a symmetrical table of collocates, that is a distance table of collocates. What this led me to think through is a way in which I could begin to compare how these different groups interacted, not just overall, but at different moments of the history that I'm interested in exploring. A table like this makes one inclined to think of, if one's familiar with digital humanities, of different ways of using this kind of distance table to start measuring the similarity between these words over time. And in fact, what I was able to create using the information that I had is a word vector analysis, a word embedding analysis, but one that's not probabilistic in its creation. That is, the normal ways of creating a word embedding analysis, Word2Vec and Glove, rely on probabilistic modeling. That is, there's a large amount of sampling that happens, and words are sort of associated because the models that are created with that sampled sections of text suggests that there is a relationship between those words, which is really good for a synchronic analysis. But the problem, as Dan Jurafsky and his collaborators have shown, as well as have many other people, it's very, very sensitive to the initial conditions of the model. So when you make multiple models over chronological time, that is, you want to show historical change, it doesn't do a good job of showing that, because you're never sure if the difference between one vector analysis to another vector analysis is because words have actually changed meaning over time, which of course they have, or if it's because the initial conditions were slightly different. And so what I was able to do with this analysis, and again following Jurafsky, is use those PMI scores to create a table of vectors that represent the similarity and differences of all the words to each other by collapsing that very sparse representation into a dense vector representation through a singular value decomposition. And I'm happy to talk more about that at the in the Q&A, but I really just want to sort of ground us in saying that this particular representation of the discourse allows us a way to see resemblances and differences, not just between the words across time, but at different points of time. So for example, we can do what's called a TSNE plot. That is, it uses those similarities and differences to create a representation of the discourse in a two-dimensional space like this, to allow us to see at one view the relationship between not just the different individual words, but the different groups, which here I've used different colors to take a look at. So for example, let me get a laser pointer. You can see that the poetry words are very tightly clustered together with rhyme, Milton, poetry. And at the other end of things, we have this set of words that come very much from the theological rhetoric of the Sublime. In other words, on this particular graph, words that are close together share a lot of meaning, and words that are farther apart are less likely to appear together, particularly in the vicinity of the Sublime. So what this graph allows us to do is sort of explore the discourse and the different ways in which it works. I don't want to dwell too long on these because I have other places I want to get to. But again, this is something I'm happy to come back to. But what I do want to briefly pause on is the way in which that the Sublime evolves. In other words, this is a static representation of the discourse over the entire 2 centuries. But we can, if I can advance the slide, there we go. This is the same graph, but only for texts written between 1660 and 1709. That is the first 50 years. And already you can see some interesting differences. For example, what I called the disciplinary Sublime and the religious Sublime are very tightly tied together up here, insofar as the Sublime is interested in professional life, that professional life is purely theology. Similarly, why Homer and Milton, our 2 poets, are together down here, the other poetry terms are scattered throughout the graph, suggesting that that discourse isn't really coherent at this point. If we move forward by 50 years, this is text written between 1710 and 1759, certain things come together. Here we have this theological Sublime differentiating from some of the discourse that had been with before, but now attaching to these theological objects. On the other hand, we have this kind of aesthetic Sublime coming together with majesty, lofty, sublime style. This begins to form a new discourse in the first half of the 18th century. In the second half of the 18th century, what we consider the apotheosis of Sublime, things really, really begin to group tightly. Here we have that Burke group coming together and occupying the same space. This is the emergence of the discourse of Burke, which shouldn't be a surprise considering that Burke was writing in 1750, and so it's in the later half of the 18th century that his discourse or his theory really came to prominence. We also have the poetry terms coming together, whereas the theological terms are actually somewhat more dispersed throughout the graph. That is, they're no longer an animating discourse in and of themselves, but rather attached to different things. And then finally, 1810 to 1860, this is after that critical horizon of the sublime, and also captures that fall in the literary horizon. Things are much less tightly bound together. That is, there's a way in which that the groups that have informed the sublime throughout its rise fall apart after that 1805 and that 1835 point. And so here, I think what we have is a graphical representation of the way in which the sublime discourse came together, changed over time, and then was both attenuated, but also began to decohere after the word itself fell out of favor. But not entirely decohere. For example, we still have groups that are important. That poetry group, the critical sublime, still seems to hang together, although without, for example, song and rhyme, and without Homer and Milton, who now exist up here at the top of the graph. In other words, the discourse doesn't go away. It just changes into something that no longer looks like what had been animating the sublime. Well, how does it change? For that, I want to argue we have to move from the telescope of looking at the corpus of one view to the microscope of using that discourse, which I've established, to look at specific works. This, for example, is Percy Shelley's defensive poetry. And what I've done is I've divided the text into equal windows, beginning at the start to the end. And for each one, I've taken the percentage of words that come from that list of the sublime. In other words, where the peaks are on this graph are points in the text where the language of the sublime is particularly activated. So here, for example, and here, versus the valleys where the sublime language seems to disappear. This gives us a grounding to read the text, not just through the graph, but actually literally sit and read the text, but with a way that allows us to turn our attention to the presence and absence of this sublime discourse. Just to show you, for example, this is on top is still Shelley's defensive poetry. This is simply a set of random words to indicate that, in fact, what I'm capturing with this variation is meaningful. If you use just a set of random words with the same frequency as the sublime words, they don't show, in fact, an interesting pattern, and they're not particularly present. Similarly, this is, again, Shelley's defensive poetry compiled to William Petty's A Treatise on Taxis, which is honestly the least sublime text that I could think of, but it gave me a way to sort of say, if we look at a text that I do have a theory about the sublime, and certainly many people have talked about the way the aesthetic of the sublime works in Shelley's text, and we compare it to a text where it doesn't seem to be, it's both much higher in Shelley's text, and it's much more variant. That is, the peaks and valleys are more meaningful than the kind of noise that we see in Petty's text. Now, what's important about these is we can use these to actually understand what the sublime is doing at particular points. And I'm going to go quickly across a couple of examples. I'm happy to return to them. I don't want to dwell on them because I want to get to the conclusion, but it's useful to see the ways in which this kind of quantitative work allows us to mount a reading that is enabled by the results, that is assisted by the results, but which doesn't necessarily give us the information alone, but allows us to combine that information with a critical understanding of what the texts are doing. So, for example, this is Jonathan Swift's A Tale of a Tub, again, measuring across the text where there appears to be particular instances of the language of the sublime. And if we find those points where they are the highest, that is, the most sublime moments of A Tale of a Tub, we find something fascinating. I realize that many of you are not 18th centuryists, and so maybe don't have the immediate knowledge of A Tale of a Tub that I naturally am expecting you to have. But what's fascinating is that The Tale of a Tub is a narrative allegory, a very satirical narrative allegory, but one that's interrupted at key moments by what Swift calls digressions. And what's fascinating is that these peaks of the sublime occur not during the moments of allegory, but at the moments of digression. In other words, those points in the text where Swift or Swift's narrator steps outside of the allegory that he's telling and gives a series of very satirical digressions in which he appears to speak directly to the reader. This is where he engages the language of the sublime. And these are two examples of the text where that happened. So for some reason, the language of the sublime is what allows Swift not to increase the sort of aesthetic value of the narrative that he's telling, but instead to step outside of that narrative, to use the language of the sublime to simulate a kind of unmediated communication with the reader. What's fascinating is if we skip forward about 80 or 90 years, and this is a graph of Blake's poem Jerusalem, one of his late epic prophecies. And again, we see a lot of peaks and valleys, places where the sublime appears to be particularly active, which we shouldn't be surprised. This is a very revelatory and apocalyptic narrative. But again, we can find a series of really interesting peaks. So 3 of the 4 highest peaks, the first one, the second one, and the third of those high peaks, are all key moments in Blake's text, not again from the narrative itself, but instead, Jerusalem's divided into 4 books. These are the introductions to books 1, 2, and 4. Now, the introduction to book 3 is down here. It's not a particularly sublime moment, but that actually here is the exception that proves the rule. Because books 1, 2, and 4, the introduction to the public, to the Christians, and to the Jews, they're all places where Burke is really trying to couch a series of instructions of how to read his text. It's again a kind of digression where he's speaking directly to the reader, or sorry, Blake is speaking directly to the reader in the hopes that he can communicate effectively the right way to read the rest of the poem. What's different about this, and I'll show you, this is the address to the public, which is one of those high points. The low point is the address to the deists, which for those of you familiar with 18th and 19th century literature, the deists are the one group of people that Blake would argue, as he does in this passage, who will never be able to understand or appreciate the texts. In other words, much like Swift, the language of the sublime for Blake is that which allows him to step outside of the text and set up this effect, this rhetorical effect of communication between author and or narrator and reader. Now, what's really interesting is the way in which James Thomson uses this in his mid-18th century poem, The Seasons. Now here, I've just given you the final season, winter. But what's interesting about this is not so much what the peaks are, but rather the pattern that they make. We have an increase across the first 2/3 of the poem, followed by a rapid fall, followed by a rise. And what's really interesting about this is if you go into the poem and look at what's actually happening and assume that this pattern is meaningful, what you find is that that first increase is kind of a training session. That is, it's the way, it's periods, points at which Thomson uses the language of the sublime to connect sort of the theological experience of confronting God with the language of nature in a way that should allow the reader to make that association. Then, during the fall, and here in these blocks of text I've highlighted words that come from the language of the sublime. You can see there's many in the training section, very few in what I'm calling the simulation. He gives a description of nature, but without that apparatus of the language of the sublime. That is, if he's trained his reader right, then the reader should encounter the sort of divine immanent nature in the simulated passage and understand how to interpret it. And just to make sure, Thomson comes back in at the end, the language of the sublime returns, and Thomson effectively is telling his reader, here is how you should have interpreted that simulated experience of nature. And what's fascinating is if you look across the poem as a whole, that same pattern is repeated in all 4 seasons. So again, it seems to have something to do with this desire for a kind of communication with the reader. So this brings us hopefully to the conclusion where I want to come back to Pater's Renaissance, because if we make the same graph of the Renaissance, we can see, in fact, there are 2 key points where the language of the sublime seems particularly active. The end, which we've already seen, but also the school of Giorgione. And this is actually fascinating because when I went in to try and start the interpretation, I naturally assumed that that second peak would not be the school of Giorgione, but rather would be his description of the Mona Lisa, La Gioconda. That, as a reader of Pater, I understood as sort of the point where the aesthetic language should be most activated. But while it is a place where the aesthetic language is most activated, it's not where the sublime is most activated. And this is a really, really interesting differentiation. This is Pater pulling from the same kind of rhetorical tropes that informed that use in the 18th century that I've hopefully shown with the graphs. Because what's happening here is that this is not a place where he is delving deeply into trying to get that aesthetic reaction at the level of language from the reader, but rather this is where he's instructing the reader how to interpret the kind of aesthetic objects that he will be discussing. In other words, there's this pedagogical aspect to the language of the sublime that understanding it quantitatively in this way seems to have revealed, and it helps us make sense, I think, as to where the sublime went. Which leads us to the final question. So what does happen to it? We've gone through the process of understanding that it does have a history, that it does reconfigure these discourses, and that we can trace these discourses into particular words. But why does it go away? Well, the explanation here is a little complicated, but it has something to do with this. To do this final experiment, what I did is I looked at the history of the sublime, which rises and then falls. And I found all words that had to do with the sublime that correlated with it, that is, that also rose and fell. Words that had the least similar trajectories, that is, that were really associated with the sublime and then fell off. And then words that rose with the sublime, but instead of falling with it, kept on rising. So these, for example, are the terms that mostly follow the trajectory of the sublime, that rise and then the fall. That's pathetic, genius, poetry, poetical, views, view, and superior. This is that very straightforward apprehension of a critical object. And pathetic here is really important, as Denise Gigante in some of her recent work, for example, has shown us. The relationship between sublime and pathetic has to do with the kind of critical apperception that became really, really important to the way the sublime is leveraged as a critical object throughout the 18th century. Highly inversely correlated terms, of course, are the religious ones, things that started very associated with the sublime and then fell off. That is this language of religion, something that was very, very tied to it, and yet, in its end, sort of had fallen away. The most interesting group, and the group I want to leave you with, these are the terms that began their rise with the sublime, but rather than falling off, although they do a little bit right here at the same time, they sort of catch themselves and continue to increase. These are the words, these are the elements of the discourse of the sublime that survive the loss of the object itself. That is, they survive that fall, that disappearance of the signifier sublime to continue on, and I argue do the same kind of work without it. And that is these words. These words are not specifically critical in that kind of literary critical way. That is, they're not the words that you necessarily use when you are writing a critical judgment of a text, but rather they are a series of critical words that have to do with a certain kind of valuation, a certain kind of larger scale philosophic judgment about the quality of certain kinds of aesthetic experience, particularly texts, objects of art, etc. In other words, what happens to the sublime that the project seems to show, and I'd be happy to go more into this in the questions, what seems to sort of follow from its history, from this new history that I've been developing, is that what the sublime loses is that kind of connection to immediate critical object and that theological discourse. But what it retains and that it's able to activate in those moments of rhetorical strategizing, where an author seems to speak directly to readers, wherein certain kinds of critics, I'm thinking particularly of Matthew Arnold, borrow that language, not to make a comment on a particular book, but to make a comment on the value of art in and of itself. What the sublime retains, what survives the sublime, is this central concept of aesthetic valuation that continues to exist in the 19th century, that we've inherited in the 20th and the 21st century, and that continues the work of the Sublime in really, really important ways, even after the term itself goes away. So thank you. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to that, as I said, 30+ minutes. I think we have, let me see if I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen. And I should be able to get back to, there we go. And so I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have. I think we've decided that you can use the little hand raising button under participants if you have a question, and I think Dylan and I are going to try and moderate.
Yes, so if you will open your participants tab, which on my screen is at the bottom. It's something that goes away and comes back when you scroll down to the lowermost extremity of your screen, and open that window. A side menu will pop up, and there should be a little hand icon that says raise hand. If you will register your interest in asking a question by clicking that, we will moderate the question period that way. So are there any questions for Mark? All right, I see Laura Stokes. I'm unmuting you now, Laura. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. That's great, Mark. I'll be talking a little bit about early English books online next week, but I'm dealing only with metadata in part because there's really not a lot of there. But I actually wanted to ask a little bit about your groups, because when you're able to do the kind of correlate spatial analysis and show us the discourses coming together and then sort of falling apart, it's all based on these groups, which I assume came out of your knowledge and analysis going into the question. And so I was wondering, is there a sort of a tautological process here? Where does that descriptive analysis come from? I'm actually quite keen on how we bring our sort of qualitative forms of analysis to this quantitative process, but I thought maybe you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And since I was condensing 400 pages into 30 minutes. That's not quite right. This was mostly the first chapter. I definitely glossed over a lot. So those groups were very much a product of the kind of combination that I'm interested in. So the groups themselves came from an actual quantitative analysis. That is, I took all of the words that emerged and I said, okay, which ones are more likely to show up together? So I made a big table of all of the words as well as all of the text out of the 310 where they show up. And I did what's called a hierarchical clustering on it. And that creates a dendrogram, and you cut the dendrogram, and then you get these groups. That's why some groups have like 2 members and some have like 15. So the actual formation of the groups is entirely quantitative, but the names of the groups, of course, are not remotely. That was a product of me having spent God knows how many hours, years, days, reading different theories of the Sublime, particularly from the long 18th century, and understanding that when you see words like eye and fire and darkness and visibility, that's very much what Burke's talking about. But if you start to see words like God and dignity and soul, that's very much something that Shaftesbury would be interested in. So in other words, those set of groups, and I put a lot of weight on them because I do think they're meaningful arrangements, because I can read them as a reader of 18th century literature and make sense out of those arrangements. That's where that critical apperception comes in. And that for me is really the advantage of doing things in this way, of sort of combining this quantitative approach with critical, which is that I can sit and read a lot of texts on the Sublime, and I might, if pressed, I could say, okay, here's a list of sort of Burke-like words, and here's a list of like theological words that I think probably belong to different discourses that are part of the Sublime. But being able to sort of do that quantitative experiment and say, okay, here are words that actually over time group together in meaningful ways, I can then bring the knowledge that I have and say, okay, I know what that group is. I've seen it before. I wasn't expecting it to have specifically those members, but I can use the knowledge that I've had. I can use that kind of critical perception to be able to identify it. And then when I see it transform across time, I can help explain why that transformation is happening.
Other questions?
Oh, I think,
Joanna.
oh, I think Catherine Harris has one,
Okay.
if you want to unmute her, Dylan.
Catherine Harris. Oh boy. Ah, yes. Hello. Unmuting you now. Go ahead, Catherine.
Hi, Mark. Thank you for giving this as a Zoom presentation. I'm just down the 101 at San Jose State, and we're working on something about this in terms of the serials and publications in London in the British Romantic period, and then also as it's replicated in India, specifically about those key concepts of British Romanticism. So this was fascinating. One of the things a question I have for you, I noticed early on that in the corpus you were limiting it to print house publications only, meaning that they were printed by a recognized printing house and then circulated. Is that what you meant by that? And by excluding the primarily manuscripts, which is the women's domain during this time?
Not exclusively the women's, of course. There were plenty of male manuscript authors. It's more that by removing the manuscripts, I am removing many of the male authors, but a much larger proportion of female authors. I'm glad you raised that, because that is the other aspect. So the Echo corpus has collected publications of some of the major broadsides and journals. So for example, the complete Spectator, the complete Tattler, the Idler, etc., are all there. But we have that other corpus, I don't know if you have it down there, British Periodicals Online, which contains like orders of magnitude more journal publications. And those, you're absolutely right, are also missing from this analysis.
Is there any plan to expand that? Because one of the concerns I had as being a really formalist in semiotics methodology is that we lose the material object that we study in book history, as well as that gendered representation of authorship, especially when we go into the British Romantic period.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. This is, the corpus that I've used has expanded in the various iterations of this project. It started with 3,000 books, I think, that I downloaded from Chadwick Healy, and has subsequently jumped up. And I've thought about certainly doing it with British Periodicals Online. The problem there, one that I've run into, honestly, is more technical, in that the quality of the OCR of BPO and other periodical publications is different enough that it really starts affecting the results that I can get from the quantitative. And so for the actual book project itself, which happily is done, or at least done for the moment, pending revisions, I decided to stop here, both for that technical reason, and because, I mean, the sort of dream of comprehensiveness is never going to happen. And so, it's just not. And it's important to acknowledge that. I'm thinking actually of Kath Bode's work here. That's who I'm very much responding to, and I've been in dialogue with her. So I have a good handle on what's in the corpus and what's not, and this is what I can carefully curate. And the whole gambit of the book project as a whole is that what I've really given you is sort of the starting point. Like this is sort of finding this kind of grounding in the stats that lets me see certain kinds of clusters and operations and forms emerge. And really, that's only about the first, not even the first third, not even the first, maybe the first quarter of the text as a whole. The real goal is to take those and sort of read them into specific works, and there be much more attuned to representations of gender, manuscript culture, other kinds of publications, and say, if this is sort of like the major circulating understanding of the Sublime, how do specific authors not just sort of unquestioningly take it, but respond to it, engage with it, push back against it, and or use it differently in their own ways. So a large part of the argument I'm making is that the only way that we can use these methods responsibly is if we combine this kind of large scale work, what I referred to as the telescope, with like the microscope, with this kind of very close attention to detail, looking at individual authors and using our critical eye perception to be able to assess what the gaps in the original corpus are doing to our ability to do this kind of large scale explanation. Although in a dream world, maybe for revision 2 of the book, I'll include BPO, a new handwritten manuscript corpus, and maybe 3 or 4 more.
Well, I think if there's gigantic problems with the database for periodicals, but there's somebody at the Library of Congress who has created a way to read through them and get past the dirty OCR. If we could get to that, we would have just a massive purview of materials for periodicals, especially with the explosion in the late 18th century, early 19th century. So I appreciate the work that you've done on this, and this is really interesting. And just as a side note, I would pay money to see you and Kath have a conversation about this. I think it would be really interesting.
We've done that privately, but we haven't put it on display yet.
Thank you for answering my questions.
I think, Eric, you're up next. And you are unmuted. Go ahead.
Perfect. Yes, thanks, Mark. I have a bit of a technical question for you. I got really excited at the end when you showed the graphs of correlates that showed the same patterns over time. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to just ask, were those correlates that you found through the pure correlation of the change over time, or were those correlates that you knew in advance? And if you found them through the graphical means, what was the method that you used?
No, that was pure change over time. So I borrowed a page from Heuser and Lecoq's pamphlet, number 4 in the Literary Lab, where they invented this thing called correlator to look at words that have the same trend over time. And I was actually joking with Ryan that I've created anti-correlator, which is words that have differing trends over time. So really what I did was I looked at, I assembled the stats by which words appeared next to the Sublime and how often and when. And I used a simple Pearson's correlation to sort of figure out which ones were the most correlated across its history. And then I divided that history into discrete periods, just 5-year sliding windows, and did the same kind of correlation, except what I was interested in are ones that significantly diverged at key points. So the ones that were completely uncorrelated were just never correlated with the Sublime. The ones that were perfectly correlated were the ones that were perfectly. And then there was that final group that I was really interested in that was sort of correlated up until those 2 points that I found early on in the presentation, that is 1810 and 1833, or sorry, 1805 and 1833. And then after those points, they were highly correlated, and then they were not correlated.
That sounds intriguing. I'll look at the pamphlet again. I'm just curious if there's other statistical methods that may be, not to doubt that, but maybe a little bit more generalizable.
Yeah.
Because that's a common problem, trying to find patterns over time that share a similar curve. But thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Giovanna, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question which is very much of the Southern European question, but I see it as possibly an opportunity also, because I wonder, on the one hand, what is the place in a lot of the criticism about the Sublime and the history of the criticism? It's sometimes can appear as leaving out Italy, for one, I just mentioned that. But one, as you have this corpora as your beginning of your database and analysis, what's striking to me is that actually there is representations of Italian text by translation, and sometimes even not translated, but printed in England in some of the databases that you're using, which comes to the fore more than it actually has been I mean, but it can instead be forgotten by subsequent historiography and criticism. And so I wonder if there is, what would be the possibilities to try to find other languages, by translation or existing non-translated English corpora, and how could that enrich or not the kind of analysis that you are doing?
That's a fantastic idea. And I mean, you've sort of like scaled up in difficulty with the different suggestions. Yeah, certainly Italy is crucial. I make a big deal out of the fact that three seemingly unconnected people all find like the most sublime object to be St. Peter's Basilica. Kant, Byron, and I think I'd have to go back to my notes, but I think it's Hemans, all sort of identify St. Peter's as like the sublime object par excellence. And I don't think at least two of those people were reading the others. In terms of this multilingual thing, I thought about this a lot from the German context. I mean, one of the big issues, of course, let me back up. Certainly doing it with the literature and translation, or even, I mean, I'm thinking of your project here, there's a lot of material in the Echo corpus particularly, that's travels to Italy that are very, very invested in this idea of sublime apperception, of the experience of the foreign. And that's actually something I'm really interested in exploring in the later chapters of the book. So that would be fairly easy to sort of subsample that corpus and say, okay, if this is what the backdrop is, how do these texts sort of deal with that differently? And that to me is a really powerful way to use these kinds of methods. In terms of the multilingual, now we're getting into like super advanced DH. One of the really interesting things is if you read like books in the Sublime, particularly recently, there's a whole debate over, is the Sublime translatable? That is, we have this word in English, sublime, we have the French sublime, and we have the German erhaben. Do those describe, in fact, the same set of, given how difficult it is to define the sublime to begin with, do those, in fact, define the same term? Really what I'd like to do at a much larger level, though not right now, is I'd love to be able to assemble differing European corpora, and ideally farther away. I know Machi, who's on this call, is thinking through the Sublime in a Chinese context at a different period, but I'm really interested to compare some results with him. But I'd love to assemble corpora in these different languages, come up with similar vector models, and then do some aligning to see, is it in fact the case that the Italian or the French or the German sublime is coexistent with English, or do they depart in really significant ways, both by just meaning, but also how they're used? It's a fantastic idea. It just takes some work to do it.
Thank you.